Hello everyone, and welcome to the making of this year's Christmas costume. I've made one of these for the last 4 years, so it feels like a tradition now, and it's one that I'm happy to be sharing. This year's costume is a bit simpler than my previous ones. The skirt is smaller and the bodice is less detailed, so you'd expect it to be easier to make. But it actually pushed me outside of my comfort zone. I'm used to making structured things and piling them with frills and ruffles. Making a sleek dress with draped details and no petticoats in sight proved to be quite a challenge. But I got it done, and to make it seem more elaborate, I paired it with some homemade accessories. Overall, I'm a lot happier with it than I expected to be, and excited to share the process of making it with you. So let's get started. So I started by pinning a fitted bodice pattern that I drafted onto stiff cotton. And I'm pinning it to 4 layers of fabric since each piece needs to be cut out twice for each side, then the boning will be sandwiched between the layers of material. I wasn't too picky about grain line, but I tried to avoid cutting the pieces out on an angle because then they will be more prone to stretching, which is not what you want when you're trying to make a sturdy base layer. All the pieces were cut out. Then I removed the pins and ironed all the pieces. And I matched the pieces up so each piece for the bodice is 2 layers of fabric thick. And now it was time to mark the boning channels. I did this by folding my pattern at the boning channel markings, then lining the unfolded edges up with the edges of the fabric. I used a marker to mark the top and bottom of the boning channel, then a ruler to connect them. I used a clear ruler to mark the other side of the boning channel, which is a 1/4 inch away from the line I already drew. This was time consuming to do, but got the job done. I sewed across these lines by machine with a medium stitch length, and I left the bottom edge open so I can slip the bones in. For metal boning you would want sturdier channels since cotton can wear down over time, but I'm using plastic for this, so the cotton is fine. After all the channels were sewn, I ironed the pieces again, then they were pinned together with the right sides facing each other. And my little trick for doing this with stiff fabrics is clipping all the concave curves before sewing so they're easier to pin. All the seams were sewn by machine. The side seams and straightish seams were sewn with a 1 inch allowance, and the curved seams were sewn with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. The seams were all ironed, then I used a clear ruler to mark lines 1/4 inch away from the front and side seams. I sewed across those lines, once again leaving the bottom edge open. I got out my spool of plastic boning and used a Sharpie to mark how long each bone should be. I cut the bones to be 3/4 of an inch shorter than the channel, since the bottom edge will eventually be turned inward. I cut each bone with regular scissors, then used a nail file to round the edges so it won't wear through the fabric. Then the boning can be inserted into the channel between the 2 layers of fabric, and this was repeated for each boning channel. If you're curious about where you can buy boning from, I'll have that mentioned in the description box. After a quick fit check, I turned the top edge inward by a 1/2 inch and sewed it down by machine. I also sewed across the bottom edge, which prevents the bones from shifting. Then I did another fitting and turned the back edge inward by 1.5 inches. I used a clear ruler to mark more boning channels, one along the back edge and another 1 inch away from it. These will keep the back edge straight and brace the eyelets, which will close the dress. These were sewn the same way as the previous ones, then filled with plastic boning. At this point I thought all the bones were added, so I folded the bottom edge inward by a 1/2 inch and pinned it in place. I didn't want to sew over the bones, so I stitched this edge down by hand with whip stitches. At this point I realized the top portion of the bodice was unsupported, which meant once the sleeves were attached, they would fold outward rather than being held in place. To fix this, I used more boning. Since the bottom edge was finished, I made external boning channels with ribbon. I sewed around each edge, then inserted more bones and sewed across the bottom edge. After a final successful fitting, I moved on to finishing the arm openings, and I did this by tracing around the arm opening onto fabric. Then I measured 1.5 inches away from the edge and cut 2 of these pieces out. These will serve as a facing. I pinned the facings onto the arm openings with the right sides facing each other, and I tucked the top ½ inch of the facing over the edge of the neckline. These were sewn on with a ½ inch seam allowance. After that was done, I clipped into the seam allowance, which helps the curves turn over smoothly. Then I folded the facings inward and pinned them down. I didn't film this part, but these were eventually secured by sewing a ½ inch away from the edge. The base was almost finished, but it was missing the supports for the sleeves, which is just a piece of ribbon. I cut 2 pieces of ribbon to an even length, then pinned them to the top points of the bodice. I tried the bodice on, then adjusted the ribbon until I liked how it laid across my shoulder. At this point the base was done, but the dress was far from finished. I pinned the base onto my dress form, then draped velvet over the form and pinned it until I liked how it looked. I trimmed away excess fabric and used basting stitches to mark where the fabric would be gathered and folded inward. I removed the velvet from my dress form and smoothed out the edges. Then I used it as a guide for cutting out another piece of velvet, which will be used for the other side of the dress. And I didn't pin the pieces of the velvet together. I just pressed around the edges, which causes the soft side of the velvet to almost interlock. I'm not sure what the technical term for this is, but it's handy since velvet is usually prone to shifting. I pinned the 2 panels together at the center front. These panels were sewn together with a 1 inch seam allowance. I used pins to mark a gathering line across the waistline of the front panels. And I sewed across this point by hand with small running stitches that were pulled as I sewed to form gathers. Each side was gathered down to approximately 2.5 inches, then the thread was tied off. I pinned the gathered panel onto the base and pinned that onto my dress form. I used this as a guide for draping the back panels. The top portion of them is the same pattern used for the base layer, but the bottom is draped in a way that complements the front panel. After successfully draping one panel, I used it as a guide for cutting out the second panel. Once again, I pressed the velvet together, then cut the panel out. As I said, the top portion of the panel was easy. I just used the pattern I made for the base layer. This wasn't the most waist-effective way of cutting the piece out, but I tried to keep the grain line even. The top edge of the back of the skirt panel was gathered down by hand until it was the same width as the upper panel. The top panel and the skirt panel were pinned together, then sewn together with a 3/4 inch seam allowance. After a quick fitting, I pinned the front and back panels together at the sides. These pieces were sewn together with a 1 inch seam allowance, and looking back I should have sewn them with a French seam to avoid raw edges, but velvet is such a freaking pain to sew and so prone to shifting that sewing each seam normally was enough frustration for me. The supposed next step would be sewing the velvet to the base layer, but I decided to sew some mesh trim onto the base layer before doing that. The trim was made from strips of silver mesh that were around 5 inches wide. After cutting them out, I ironed the strips in half. The strips were pinned onto the neckline at the base layer, so they extend 3/4 of an inch past the neckline, and these strips continued onto the ribbon, which will eventually be the base for the sleeves. You may notice a piece of white material at the front. That was added so I could bring the silver mesh down lower, but it didn't end up working, so I didn't bother including the footage. I sewed this trim on by machine. All these stitches will be hidden by the velvet, which is actually why I attached the trim before the velvet layer. And that's where I'm going to end this video. I know it doesn't look like much yet, which is part of the reason why draped garments are so scary. They don't come together until the very end. But have faith, I promise it turned out well, or at least I think it did. If you want to see a more detailed write-up about this costume, more information about it in general, or my previous Christmas costumes, then check out the description box. There should be a ton of relevant things linked there. Thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it, and we'll be back with part 2 next week, so definitely subscribe or stick around if you're interested in that. Thanks again for watching, and I'll talk to all of you very soon.